All right, welcome to this week's episode of Resisting the Dragon's Beast. We're going to be finishing up the second half of the chapter on fear. So if you're following along in the book, we're on page 170. And Jesus there says, stop being afraid. So the question I have for you, Peter, is that over six dozen times, God's people here in Scripture do not be afraid. Why do you think God has to remind his people about that admonition so often?
I think we're naturally fearful people because there's a lot that is outside of our control, and a lot that we think we have to control, and a lot that could be intimidating. That especially if we have a real understanding of sin and grace and our frailty and our mortality. And then we're like, wow, I could just be doing my thing, and then all of a sudden, aneurysm, heart attack, stroke, and you're done, you're gone. That if we lived our lives completely driven by fear, then it really means that we respect or love something more than we love our Lord. And for the Christian who lives under God's blessing, the Christian who has the name of Christ on them in holy baptism, we don't have to be afraid of anything. And so God says, don't fear, because he doesn't want idolatry sneaking in the side door or the back door under the guise of fear. And now I just have to, be afraid of this.
Yeah. And the key is all those times when Jesus says, do not be afraid, at least some of them, it really means stop being afraid. And when I was thinking about this morning, that when, you and I as parents, tell our kids, stop it, and you raise your voice and there's an exclamation point or two at the end of your sentence, it means right now. And I think sometimes when we say, Jesus says, do not be afraid, it's kind of like, all right, well, maybe I can be afraid, maybe I can't. But when he says, stop, you just don't do it. It's like when, again, telling my kids, stop doing that, or
knock it off.
Knock it off. Stop where you're at. This is dangerous over here. And that's the force of what Jesus is saying. Because like you said, when we don't stop being afraid, that's allowing the devil to come in. That's allowing fear to maybe become a god, or to allow other things to become a god instead of the one true God.
Yeah, definitely. And to understand fear, what is it that you're afraid of? And you just pick that thread up, and you'll find what is it that you love and you're afraid of losing. And you just keep following that thread and you unravel it, and you're like, oh, well, what is it that has actually displaced love for God in my heart? What is it that has displaced fearing, loving, and trusting God above all things in my heart? Well, and then the next level of thinking that I have some control over this, and now it's all up to me, and so much depends on me. And that is not really the case.
Right. And that leads to the next point, Matthew chapter 6. I'm not going to read the whole thing on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount when he preaches about do not worry. But the key there is why do we never have to worry? Why do we never have to be afraid? Part of it is, this is what I teach on worry, is that you don't need to worry about the things you can't change, because you can't change them. So just let it go. And don't worry about the things you can change, because you just need to change it. Okay. and that's the thing, is a big part of what we're talking about here is we stay in our lanes. And if God gives us a lane where we can do something about it. I think in the English language, concern and worry are often used as synonyms. But again, the way I teach it is, worry, I can't do anything about it. Concern, I can do something about it. So let me go and be concerned about this issue and then go work at it.
Yeah, and I think I've taught it a similar way. I remember preaching a sermon about the difference between worry and proper Christian concern. That proper Christian concern begins with our vocation. So, for instance, is it my proper Christian concern to say, to deliberate and debate the politics of, which ambassador to Venezuela we should have? No, that's not part of my vocation. I haven't been called to serve as a politician. that my vocation is as a husband, as a father, as a pastor, and in that order. And so I should have proper Christian concern about the things that pertain to that. And I can't have, proper Christian concern means, when the 16-year-old is going out the door, at 9 o'clock at night, say, hi, I'm going to a friend's house, and I'll be back when I get home. Well, then the parent says, well, time out. First of all, it's snowing. Second of all, I don't know where you're going. Third of all, it's 9 o'clock at night and I'm the parent. I have proper Christian concern about where you're going and how you're getting there. That is a completely different thing about all the things that we worry about that are not part of our current vocation. Like, am I worried about having a heart attack in 20 years? Or 10 years, or, depending on your family health history, something similar for you. Maybe, but that distracts us from the proper Christian concern of our stewardship of the body right now, that I want to take care of the things that I have been given now and to manage them properly. And so that means paying attention closely to what God has given me to do today, which is defined by vocation and God's law. And obviously we are propelled along to serve God in those ways by the truth of his gospel. But that gives us the boundaries of our lane, I suppose you could say.
Sure. Yeah, and then I talk on page 171 in the middle there about John Chrysostom. So he's a patriarch of Constantinople in the 4th century. And I just want to read what he says there. So the Roman emperor had arrested and charged Chrysostom with being a Christian, which was illegal. If Chrysostom did not renounce Christ, then the emperor would have this Christian leader banished from the kingdom. Chrysostom responded to the threat by saying that the emperor could not do so because, quote, the whole world is my father's kingdom. Then replied the emperor, I'll take away your life. To which Chrysostom said, you cannot, for my life is hid with Christ in God. The emperor next threatened with the loss of his treasure, to which this saint replied, you cannot, for my treasure is in heaven where my heart is. And the emperor made one last effort. Then I will drive you away from here and you will have no friend left. But again, Chrysostom responded, you cannot, for I have one friend from whom you can never separate me. I defy you, for you can do me no harm. So what lesson, Peter, can we learn from Chrysostom?
I kind of put myself in his shoes for a second, and the emperor says renounce your Christianity, and the way of many of those people in the early centuries were, okay, yes, I do, and others said no, I don't, and then maybe they were exiled or they were banished or they were killed and martyred, that sort of a thing. But the fact that Chrysostom saw every opportunity to give a confession, because the truth was, the truth that was so firmly planted in his heart was that this Jesus Christ was his everything, that this Jesus Christ has risen from the dead, and just applying those truths to these threats from the emperor, which are really measly, puny threats, like, oh no, you're going to kick me out. Where am I going to go? I'm still under the kingdom of Christ. And the fact that he answered that way, that is, there's the normal answer of yes, I deny Christ, which is not an option for Christians. The second answer of no, I do not deny Christ, and you can kill me for it. Or the third answer, that you want to make the good confession, that you want to, confess the truth and follow through with that, which is going to be basically, I do not renounce, but with the purpose of saying, this is what I believe, and this is why your threats don't intimidate me.
Yeah, and the way I was thinking of it is that too often we are holding on to so much stuff. We have our house, so then the emperor could take away our house. We have our stuff, and the emperor can take away our stuff. We have our family, and then the emperor can take away our family. We have our health and our freedom, and the emperor can take away our health and freedom. But if we realize, I'm just passing through, and I'm backpacking, I'm hiking. And so I just have my backpack. You can take my house, it doesn't matter. You can take my stuff. I don't need any of that stuff. You know what? You can even take my family. I'll see my family again later on in heaven.
Mhm.
And all of those things, when we hold on too tightly, well, then the world, governments, the devil, they all have, their little claws into us. But when we free ourselves from those things, and that's why Jesus says to give up all those things, to put his kingdom first, then when those things are taken away from us, it doesn't matter to us because we don't need any of those things to get to heaven. And those things that do matter the most to us, which is our family, Lord willing, we'll see them again in heaven.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the hymn of Mighty Fortress, which I think we're singing this Sunday. And take they our life, good fame, child, and wife, though all may be gone, the victory is won. And just that confidence that, here's Luther who says, you know what, they can do what they will, but what will they actually gain? And what will I actually lose? Well, absolutely nothing. And if we live at a time where we have never made a confession to the point where it brought us pain or suffering or conflict, well, then we haven't really learned how to confess the faith, especially in all circumstances. We just have, maybe possibly been sitting back and been passive recipients of all the blessings that God has to offer. But as far as practicing those and confessing those, well, that's a little uncomfortable, and I don't want to risk losing fill in the blank.
Yeah. And then talking about, risking that, the next question I have is, the red dragon and his two beasts are terrifying creatures. Who could blame us if we became afraid, renounced our faith, shirk our responsibilities, and would take the easy way out? Who could blame us, Peter? If we just if we just said, you know what, I'm taking the easy way out.
You're right. It'll be so easy. And realistically, would you be able to look yourself in the mirror?
Yeah. And the point I'm getting at there is, who could blame us? Well, God could blame us.
Yeah.
Jesus says, whoever denies me before others, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. And so, yeah, God will blame us. Jesus will blame us. And, we don't like this kind of talk. We prefer a weak milk toast type of Jesus.
Yep. And it's like Jesus says, don't fear those who can kill the body and can do no more. No, fear the one, capital O, who can throw you body and soul into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Like that is a strong club of the law against our shirking sinful flesh that wants to keep quiet and doesn't want anybody to, ruffle feathers with me, because, I'm just over here doing my thing. You go do your thing, and we'll just agree to disagree and leave each other alone. But in what world is that a Christian attitude?
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to be talking about this with my associate Nathan on our Thirsty podcast about the whole Super Bowl ad on Jesus Gets Us. And so we won't talk about it here so much, but just that idea of Jesus gets us, and everything I've read on that, it often is, the Christians are coming down hard on that because they're making Jesus as that weak milk toast, just looking at love as opposed to justice. And then I watched a Babylon Bee video, and it was Satan Gets Us. I thought that was pretty pointed, because he wants us to be in our sin. And I just bring it up here because, again, we don't like this firm kind of language. The other day in my adult confirmation class, the young lady who's in her 20s, she said, yeah, Pastor, I didn't understand this statement in the homework section on where Jesus says that we are to hate our brothers and sisters and father and mother. What does that mean? I thought Jesus was love. And then just explaining, yeah, this is harsh language. We don't understand this type of language. We don't like this type of language because we want to have Jesus and everything else. And Jesus says, no, you have me. I'll give you everything else, but I may take those things away too. And you need to be prepared to be satisfied with it one way or the other.
Oh, totally. And it's one of my friends on Facebook friends put it like this. He's a pastor out in the Seattle area. He said, I haven't had one person visit my church or started a conversation with me from the He Gets Us campaign. 0. I've consequently seen much division and arguments with Christians on social media, though.
Yeah.
But and it's like, okay, if that here's my little bit of editorializing. The what I had heard, I didn't look into this too deeply, obviously, was that basically the same family that runs Hobby Lobby is the ones who are funding the He Gets Us campaign. And I really appreciate the efforts that the Hobby Lobby group did in bringing and challenging some laws at the Supreme Court level. And given their theology and the He Gets Us campaign, maybe they should limit themselves to exercising their rights as a corporation and then challenging it at the Supreme Court, and let the Christians sort out how to proclaim Christ to this culture.
Yeah, and then with that too, I had also read that same group was putting these ads together, but they also included in their focus group non-Christians. And so when you bring in non-Christians, you're always going to be watering down this true Jesus. And then, one of the things that we were definitely afraid of, and that's why I wrote this chapter, was the fear of death. And Revelation pictures death as a pale rider. And when we are afraid of death, then we are letting death win. And we're just trying to avoid it. And so the key is we're going to look at toward the end of this chapter, why we don't need to be afraid of death. But then, I don't know, did you know much about Saint Cyprian?
Not a whole lot. I think we did some reading about him in Latin during college. Okay. Was that the one where they caught his blood in the napkin as he was beheaded?
That I don't know. So here's the
sticking in my mind.
Okay.
That's worth researching.
All right. Well, here's the interesting thing on this chapter is, I was working on this chapter, and the way I wrote the book was I would be, typing and writing all kinds of notes there, and it took me like a couple of weeks just to compile everything together. But when I was working on this one on fear, I remember just Googling something about fear, and then this sermon by Saint Cyprian came up. And so I listened to the sermon. So obviously it was another guy that did this sermon because
it wasn't a recording.
It wasn't an original 3rd century AD recording. But I still remember I Googled it and I found it from another conservative Lutheran. And then, I was cleaning the house, listening to Saint Cyprian's sermon, and I just kept writing notes instead of cleaning, going, and this is good. And then that's why there's so much of Saint Cyprian's sermon in this text. And so I just wanted to read a little bit of it, and then we can discuss it. So on page 173, he says, so this is the second paragraph, doubtless let him fear to die, and only him who unborn of water and of the Spirit is the property of hellfire. Let him fear to die, who is without title in the cross and passion of Christ. Let him fear to die, who is to pass from death here into the second death. Let him fear to die, on whom at his going away from life an eternal flame will lay pains that never cease. Let him fear to die, on whom the longer day confers this boon, that his tortures and groans will begin later. What he's talking about there is unbelievers. Those are the ones who should fear death, not Christians. And yet, I remember, Peter, a lot of us as Christians were very afraid of dying from this COVID disease. And people were then, they were justifying their fear, saying, well, Jesus doesn't want us to die from this. No, it's okay to die from this.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
So
we don't want to be foolhardy, but at the
right.
same point, what are we actually afraid of? And maybe that kind of opens the door. I was having this conversation last night with one of our members who was doing some genealogy work, and he said, he in some of the family tree further back, they had like 8 or 10 kids in this household, and in the space of a week and a half, 2 of the children died, and then a month and a half later, another child died. And it's just kind of this basic general question at a time when our average birth rate is like 2.1 children. We're right around replacement rate, maybe a little bit higher, but we aren't having families of 8, 10, 12, 14 children, and we aren't the ones who are helping and assisting and nursing these people during their final days. They're in a nursing home, they're in hospice care, they are medicated, and we don't hear all the and see all the progression of death as it takes our loved ones out of the world. And we aren't personally, opening up our homes as a funeral home for the visitation and for the funeral. We just aren't dealing with death in the same way that the rest of the world has for most of history. And the kind of sterilization of death, and it's all locked away in hospitals, and we let the professionals handle it. And then we just see, we see Granny in the casket when she's looking as lifelike as they can make her look. That wonderful, I guess, but something is lost when we are so detached from dealing with death. And it's the same thing when we're dealing with like the sacrifices of the Old Testament. That was another conversation I had last night, not to hijack this whole discussion, but I will. Another conversation, I had a member who was cleaning 2 deer, because deer season just ended for archery here. And he was cleaning 2 deer, and at the same time as he was listening to the book of Leviticus. And so he's like, wait, time out. All these sacrifices they had, all this that they had to deal with, that temple, that tabernacle must have stunk, because they're dealing with all this blood. You're just gonna have like a third of the Levites are working as butchers and cleaning up after the butchering, and all we know, for probably the majority of Americans, if you eat meat, it is probably something that you just got at the grocery store that is neatly packaged and in a freezer case and under some fluorescent light, and it looks appealing. But it's a totally different thing to be looking at the animal in your backyard, chicken or cow or the fattened calf or whatever it may be, and looking at how am I going to slaughter this and break it down and then preserve it, because we're kind of detached from that. And so when this whole specter of death comes along, whether it's this pandemic or something else, we are so totally discombobulated because we're detached from death. It's just something sterile that happens somewhere else. It's just a medical thing that we aren't privy to. And all we see is somebody doing their best to dress up death as well as they can.
Yeah, and I think that's important, what you're saying there of sterilizing death and not being used to it. A lot of people are not taking their children to funerals either. And so that
that's crazy.
So they're not used to death. And then since you talked about that, I think the same thing with just even going to the hospital, nursing homes, and so forth. So I'm over halfway through listening to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know if you've read that.
Oh, yeah.
I just got
other book.
No.
Oh, apparently it's even better.
Okay, I'll have to look that one up, and so then I reserved from the library today the movie, which swept the Academy Awards. So, but the key is, the reason I bring up that is, you and I have been in plenty of nursing homes and assisted living centers and so forth, and some of them are not real nice, but we've become desensitized to that too, because now we can put someone over there, or other people can put them over there. Whereas it used to be in the culture, the people were in our own homes. Our children, our elderly grandparents, those who were ill, injured, were taking care of everyone. And so we were used to death. And so again, as Christians, we weren't afraid of death. And that's what St. Cyprian is pointing out here is only unbelievers should be afraid of death. And then he has some other strong words. This is in the middle of page 173. Since the world hates a Christian, why do you love that which hates you and not rather follow Christ who has redeemed and loves you? So it's, again, some more strong words going, we've heard conservative commentators say this. Why do you support businesses that hate you? That's the way I would say it too. This world hates us. They want nothing to do with us. So what I said last night in my Ash Wednesday sermon was that 2/3 of Americans are now saying that they are Christians. That's down from just a generation ago where it was 3/4 of people. And we might say, woe is me as Christians, and yet the world is celebrating that we are having less and less influence in our culture, that there are fewer and fewer of our Christian values that are influencing anything in our culture and our nation. They hate us. So why do we hold so strongly to this world when it wants nothing to do with us?
Yeah. And yeah, it's just an understanding of, why do you want to sit with the cool kids at lunch? Because the lunch bell's going to be ringing soon.
They're just the mean girls. There's a movie reference for you, for our lady listeners.
There you go. Yeah, if you want a book recommendation for the day, it's kind of a written for a 10 to 12-year-old age level, at least in the vocabulary, but the topic gets a little bit deeper than that. It's called A Day No Pigs Would Die. A Day No Pigs Would Die. And it's about a father who is a pig butcherer, and he is terminally ill. And then how does he prepare his son for the day when he would eventually pass from this world? I read it last year. It wasn't especially cheery, but it was definitely worthwhile. And maybe fifth grade, maybe your fifth grade or sixth grader gives it a read, and it's worth talking about.
Have you had your kids read it?
Well, he's in fourth grade right now, is our oldest one. So I pre-read it to kind of say, when would this fit? And yeah, we'll get around to it next year. We're still working our way through the Grimm's fairy tales and the Blue Fairy book, which are fantastic.
I'm just asking because you have homeschool kids, so they're on a higher, they're a different level than public school kids, and even Lutheran elementary kids.
They're children, yeah, they're children, and we have the privilege, the responsibility of not moving them along faster than they can handle, and I think as parents we take that seriously, and we definitely have our approach on it. But it is a book that we will read. We read Where the Red Fern Grows this past summer, and that just broke everybody's heart, which it always does. But someday we'll get past dogs dying, and then we'll get on to some deeper topics like in that book. Okay.
Yeah, and I quote John in 1 John 2. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, boasting about material possessions, is not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the one who does the will of God remains forever. And so there I asked the question, are we loving the world more than loving the Lord if we do all we can to prolong life? I think that's a poignant question.
Yeah, it's very pointed, and to be able to just ask that and say, well, what do you think? Do we have the response? I mean, Christians have a very different approach to death. You talk to a Christian who's terminally ill, and they're like, what, Pastor, my time here is done. I've lived a long life. God's been very good to me. I know where I'm going, and I'm ready to go when Jesus calls me home. You talk to somebody, or you see somebody who is not a Christian, and they are the ones who are grasping for absolutely every last chance that they can get. Now, it's not wrong for a Christian to pursue some of those experimental therapies, like in stage drug trials or whatever it may be for cancer. Who knows? It's not wrong in and of itself, but we do have to understand that what we lose here is not lost. that when Jesus refers to Moses at the burning bush, that God said to Moses at the burning bush, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." What he meant was those guys had been in the tomb for nearly 600 years, most of them. And yet God was still their God, that even though they had passed away, they weren't lost, that Jesus was still shepherding his people, just that now they were in heaven with him.
Yeah, and when we're talking about death, then this next question is, how does the fact that
episode?
Yeah, how does the fact that God will not let you die one moment sooner than he has planned help you overcome your fear of death and illnesses, viruses, and accidents that lead to death? And the reason I wrote that question is I had people that became very upset because their spouse died, supposedly of COVID, their grandma or aunt got sick and died of COVID, supposedly because someone came to a party that was sick with COVID. And then, they're upset. And, the one spouse was upset. Well, we were so careful. And then the other one, she was very upset with her family member that came sick to a party, killed grandma. And they're counseling both of them to say, God had this planned from eternity, that your spouse, that your grandma was going to die. And if they died of COVID, well, that was just the means that God used to kill them and bring them home to heaven.
Psalm 139, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And how foolish to think that we who can't permanently change a gray hair to brown or black again. We can't do that. We can't change a hair of our head. How foolish to think that we are the ones in charge of extending our lives, or that we can point the finger and say, well, you were the one who killed grandma, which is what the world says. And it's exactly what they were saying, that you have to do this or else you're going to kill grandma. There obviously there is a point for caution. And same as with any other sickness, if you have a hacking cough or you're feeling under the weather, then go home and go to sleep. Don't feel, and I guess that's the other side of it. Don't feel so duty bound to come to church that you're just going to sit and struggle through church, coughing through the whole thing. We've all encountered people like that who, it's like, oh, you can come on out, I'll get you a glass of water. And they say, no, thanks, Pastor, I'm good. No, you're not. You're hacking up a lung, and people are staying like 15, 20 feet away from you because we all know that we don't want the cough that you have. And that's just a regular cough. But these people aren't afraid of death. But we also, that doesn't tilt us completely the other way to say, I'm just going to be foolhardy and not wear my seatbelt and drive 80 miles on the highway. We still have a responsibility according to our vocation, according to stewardship, according to God's law, and it's all propelled along by the grace of our God who gives us everything.
Well, that person that was just hacking up along, that was probably me on Sunday. My sermon was pretty gruff. Well, not the text, but my voice was
delivery.
That was the first time I had talked in 2 days. I got up in the pulpit and, oh, this is pretty rough. And then I went home and didn't talk to anyone for another 2 days until preached for Ash Wednesday service, and it sounded a little bit better. Someone even emailed me today, said, Pastor, you sounded a little rough last night. I said, well, you weren't in church then on Sunday, because it was a lot better, because people are asking me, how are you feeling now? And I said, well, since I was almost dead last week, now I'm only half dead. And hopefully they got the Princess Bride reference.
Yeah, mostly dead is a little alive.
Yeah. So then, again, talking about death, why is the annual trip with women every year on Easter so important for us as Christians, Peter?
Oh, yeah. And I would even rewind to to yesterday, which we're recording this the day after Ash Wednesday, that Ash Wednesday is like the start of the valley of Lent. And we hear at the beginning of Lent, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And Lent is this valley that we're walking through, the valley of the shadow of death. And, we confront our sin, we hear about our sin, but then we see, most of all, our Savior carrying our sin. And the valley of Lent that began with, remember you are dust, leads to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that the one who shares our humanity, who became a human flesh just like us, he has conquered death. And so, that's the rest of the statement that began on Ash Wednesday. The conclusion to the statement is, even though you are dust, and to dust you shall return, that when your body is buried, when you're cremated, whatever the case may be, this Jesus who broke the power of death will raise you from the dead. And I think it is important to walk along with the women to understand, experience in some small way the emotion, the loss that the expectation, the grief. I mean, they're grieving. They're thinking of all the things that they lost. They thought, oh, we thought he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. We thought that he was going to be that he was the Lamb of God. We thought that he would be the Messiah. And now it looks like a failure. To walk along with them gives us the ability to kind of experience their grief also applied to us. And so then we see the resurrection of Jesus, and we see that victory over death means that Jesus has taken away every reason for grief. Even though we grieve in the short term, even though we will experience funerals, at the same time, the victory of Jesus means that, death is a loser.
Yeah, and like you said, Jesus' death means that we don't have to be, we don't have to mourn death. But I think here we also don't need to be afraid of death. There, some of the spy novels that I read, I've got Jack Reacher, who's from Lead Child, and Scott Harvath by Brad Thor, Mitch Rapp, Vince Flynn. But those guys, Mitch Rapp and Jack Reacher and Scott Harvath, when they go against the enemy, they're like untouchable. And that's what I was thinking of here, is because we are Christians, we are untouchable. Meaning that all these guys, they can get banged up, they can get shot whenever the authors want to end the book or whatever. But the key is, for us, we are untouchable until Christ wants to end the book for us and we go home to heaven. We are these spy masters, and we go up against the big bad enemy of the devil, and we are going to be victorious. And that's what we need to have every Easter. Just keep remembering that annual trip with those women, and they were afraid, yes, and that's why the angel reminds them, do not be afraid. He is not here. He has risen, just like he said he would. You wouldn't have been afraid if you would have believed the whole time. And it's the same way with us. If we believe the whole time that we are victorious, we don't need to be afraid of anything, because Jesus has overcome the biggest thing of death.
Yeah, and I mean, that's exactly where Paul goes at the end of Romans chapter 8. He's like, okay, try me, test me on this. What in the world, or what outside of this world, do you think can separate you from the love of Christ? Name it. Come on, give me something that will separate you from Jesus. And he goes down the list: trouble, famine, nakedness, dangerous sword, angels, demons, etc. He just goes on. And he says, no, absolutely not. In all these things we are conquerors, because Jesus has conquered death. And because that conquering resurrection has been brought into your life through holy baptism. That's a tangible, tactile moment in your own personal history where God himself reached out and touched you and made you his own and said, this one belongs to me. Like, okay, what is it that we are actually afraid of here?
Yeah, and then the last question I have is, since we talked about the pale rider of death in Revelation chapter 6, why do we not need to fear that pale rider? Well, Revelation 6 verse 2 says there's another rider. It's Christ rides victorious on his white horse. There I write at the bottom of page 177, even in a fallen world where death, and there I capitalized death rides its pale horse to haunt and hunt us down, Jesus still patiently reassures us, do not be afraid. Death's back is broken. Satan has been stomped. The gates of Hades have been ripped off their hinges. Christ rides victorious on his white horse. He has conquered and he continues to conquer. Death is the last enemy to be done away with. If death is done, nothing else can win. If death has been destroyed, then there is nothing else to fear.
And so that's kind of my question for you. I don't have this written down, obviously, but do we have a tendency or an inclination to focus more on the sorrowful, the suffering, the trial, the temptation, the weakness, the failure, and being like, okay, well, Jesus won, but things are still a struggle here. And Jesus won, but we still got to be working here. And is there a tendency to do that, to preach that way in our circles? And if so, how do we address that? Or what is different about this attitude?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I don't know how other guys preach. I guess the big thing is, like we said earlier, is we just have to be bold as preachers. We have to be bold as listeners, and applying what we hear from the pulpit. And it can be, you and I joke a lot about length of sermons and so forth. The key, though, whether it's a shorter sermon or a longer sermon, is it's got to be a powerful sermon. And it's got to be straightforward. All of these times of do not fear, and why not fear? It's because Christ is victorious. I don't know where you were going with your question.
Yeah,
you were thinking.
I do think that there is a tendency to accommodate ourselves to the idea that this is simply spiritual victory, but it's all in the future. And we are Lutherans, so that means theology of the cross all the time. And we can't talk about victory. We can't talk about glory. We can't talk about, Christ's victory over the devil as something that is real and applies to us now. I do think that there is that possibility. And to be able to talk about victory in a way that is glorious, but is not a theology of glory. That is possibly the challenge. Because if all we have to offer is, hey, you work your best, Jesus will fix it all in the end, and but you got to do your best, and life here is a world of sin and death and pain and suffering until he takes you out of it. If that's all we have to offer as a church, then it's kind of this subtle form of Gnosticism that separates the spiritual from the physical life. And okay, Jesus gave you the spiritual victory, but as far as this physical life, it will always be failure and it'll always be struggle. And yes, it will be, but we also have to apply that spiritual truth to our lives in a very practical way. And I think this is part of it. To understand, how does the resurrection of Jesus affect the way that I feel about this particular health challenge?
To that point, Peter, right at the end, what you were talking about, that separation, I think sometimes we do get that way in our preaching, is it only becomes spiritual. And, this is going back to, these comments about separating the two kingdoms, the spiritual and physical kingdoms. And I think a lot of times as pastors, we focus so much on the spiritual kingdom, we forget that we as pastors, but all of our people are living every day as well in the physical kingdom. And we need to preach that same way when it comes to this victory on the last day. It is also a victory every day that we're living in this physical realm, that Jesus does give us spiritual victory, but that's inside of our very physical bodies, because sin is not just something that's inside of us, but it comes out physically in everything that we're thinking and in our saying and what we're doing. So it's a very physical thing. And it's the same way with the way that we live. The ailments that we have, they can affect us spiritually, but they're often affecting us spiritually because they're affecting us emotionally and physically. And so we need to be able to preach, yeah, Jesus Christ takes care of these spiritual ailments, but he's also applying that to your physical ailments and your physical body. And on the last day, you rise not just with a spiritual body, but a very physical body too.
Yeah, and I guess together with that, if we separate the spiritual and physical when we talk about the blessings of the gospel, then we also risk separating spiritual and physical when we're talking about sin. And like modern psychology is finally catching up with this. We talk about, the way that stress affects your health, the way that your attitude about, whatever happened, whatever trauma happened in your background. It's not just what happened to you, but it's also how you think about what happened to you. That can have, beneficial or detrimental health effects in your modern day life. And so like modern science and medical science says that the way you think about something, that the spiritual side, as far as they understand, the spiritual side can have a physical effect. And Christians have known that believers have known that for 4,000 years, that when you confess your sin, we're confessing a spiritual thing that I have erred, I have sinned against God and his moral law, and I have, my body has been a willing participant in that, the words that I say or the thoughts that I think. But that confession does have a physical relief to it. Like to hear that, the pastor says, for the sake of Jesus Christ, I forgive you. That you can walk out there, and we're not enthusiasts to say, yes, I hope you feel better after your confession, because if you aren't walking out a little bit more with a little bit more spring in your step, then let's go back and look at this just a little bit more, because this Jesus has brought healing and relief from your shame, and he's brought cleansing for not just for you and for your sin, but also and the guilt of your sin, but also for the effects of that sin in your life. Yeah, I gotta work on that one a little bit, because there's a couple nuances to kind of tease out, but knitting together the physical and spiritual, I think is a challenge that is more easily bypassed than actually wrestled with.
All right, well, we're going to wrap it up here. So the key is just stop being afraid. There you go. There's my encouragement right from Jesus. And then we'll meet, Lord willing, next week, as we're going to talk about the next chapter on freedom. And freedom is it is not a spiritual thing. Well, yeah, the spiritual freedom that Christ gives us. But here I'm talking about the physical freedom that we have. And the way we'll talk about it in this chapter is it is something that God gives us. And therefore, it is a gift that we need to be protecting and protective of. So we'll talk about that more next week. We'll see y'all then.